Well, today we're going to talk about niches or niches, if you prefer. I've heard it said both ways, but I'm going to say niche or niches because I think that that's more correct. It sounds better than niche. So let's get into it. Today's learning outcomes is by the end of this, hopefully you can identify examples of niches, and actually just even knowing what a niche is a part of that. And then also that you can describe the role of variation in enabling closely related living things to survive in the same ecosystem. Spoiler, that relates to niches as well. So we're gonna get into that. So let's first kind of brainstorm, or you think, what roles do you fill? So in society and life, what do you do? Are you a consumer? Are you a son or daughter? Are you a friend to someone? Are you someone who eats food? Even are you, let's say, somebody who is a vegetarian, right? Versus somebody who maybe is a meat eater, right? These are all things that are part of essentially your niche. It's the role that you play. So what is a niche? Here's the definition. A niche is the role an organism plays in its environment. A niche includes both where an animal lives and what it does. That's the definition. A niche is where an animal lives and what it does, essentially, which we call like the role that it plays within the ecosystem. So the niche of an organism or a population may not be the same as a population of the same species living in a different area. Different animals can actually have different niches depending on where they are. For example, they could actually have like a different diet, or they could live in some kind of like a different circumstance. So let's say we're talking about a dog. Okay, a dog that's living within, and this is kind of a poor example, but it's what I came up with. A dog that's living in the house is going to be different than a street dog that's roaming through the streets in terms of, for example, what it eats and what it does. These are all going to be different, and therefore it has a different niche. So when I'm looking at basically an organism, I can talk about what it lives and what it does, and that is essentially its niche. And the reason why we care about niches is that in order for something to survive, it needs to not share niches with a lot of things. Because if it does share niches with a lot of things, then we get competition. And competition is bad for the survival of that thing, of that organism. Okay, so same species living in a different area, because the resources and competition would not be the same if we have a different area, even if it's the same species. The niche of an organism will change throughout its lifetime. Think about your niche and how it's changed since, let's say, when you were a baby to now, right? Things have changed quite a bit in terms of what you do and so on, and the role that you play. When you look at something like a fly, for example, think about that. It's a maggot to begin with, yeah, and then it just totally changes, even in terms of what it's eating and feeding on and what it does. I mean, it's a completely different scenario or role that it plays from the beginning of its life to the end of its life. So any organism that we look at, for the most part, its niche will actually change, sometimes just slightly, but it will change throughout its lifetime. When organisms require the same resources but share them easily by occupying slightly different niches from one another, this is called resource partitioning. So another term here, and again, this all has to do with minimizing competition. So if I take a look at these warblers, what's neat about these warblers in the diagram that you see is that they actually separate slightly different niches by living on different parts of the tree. So for example, the Cape May warbler actually just kind of hangs out from here to up here, okay? Now it has a little bit of overlap with the bay-breasted warbler, which lives from here to down here. But they actually have managed to partition this resource of basically using the tree for a home to be able to not have competition. So it's basically saying like, hey, this part's mine and that part is yours. And that's called resource partitioning, which is something that's somewhat common in nature. And as a result, the similar species, all these different species of warbler, do not end up directly competing for the same resource. And let's say that they're getting food from this tree as well, then they're not competing for food because they actually stick to their certain areas of the tree. Now, what's interesting about this is this would actually be something that is ingrained in them. That is behavior that they just actually have. So it would be an inherited trait. It would move on from one generation to the next. When organisms occupy a common habitat and need to share the available resources, it can lead to, like we talked about, competition between two species or even between members of the same species. There are not enough resources to go around, both species will suffer, or both organisms will suffer. Starvation and death might occur, limiting the size of both populations. So having a unique niche is an advantage. Whenever two organisms compete for resources, variations between the individuals may give one of them an advantage. The individuals with the best adaptations will survive to reproduce and will eventually take over. So when organisms have a unique niche, right, then they will survive. Sometimes they even use this in business talk where they'll say like, hey, looks like you found your niche, which means that you found your area of the market. You have a special thing that you do that other companies don't do, which allows you to survive and make money. When we talk about organisms and they have a unique niche, it means that that organism has a special role and food and stuff that it does where it doesn't have to compete with other organisms or species. And that's its niche. Now, another thing that an organism can do is it can have a broad niche. So when I talk about, for example, what it can eat many, many different kinds of things. And then as a result, that's a massive advantage because if one food source goes away, it can actually adapt and go to a different food source. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, species on our planet are not distributed evenly. Surprise, surprise. If I take a look at the Earth, where do you think on this diagram, and I don't know how I'm going to point this out, where do you think we're going to see the most variation or the most amount of species within an area? In other words, which area will have the greatest biological diversity? And the answer is around the equator. The closer we get to the equator, the more biological diversity we end up having. So if we look at the poles, right, the North Pole, the South Pole, there's very low biological diversity there, which means we don't have a lot of organisms or species that can survive those really harsh conditions. But as we move towards the equator, we find regions with immense biological diversity, which means we have many, many different types of organisms and species, like in the rainforest, which have diverse plant communities that provide food and shelter to a wide variety of other organisms. There are even species that we have not discovered yet in the rainforest, for example, because they're just so specialized. And there's a low population, a low number of them, but they survive because they have their niche. They have their food that they eat, the place that they live, and as a result, they are able to survive. So now let's talk about broad versus narrow niches. So broad niches apply to what we call generalist species. So when we talk about a generalist, we're saying something that can do a lot of different things, right? So when you have a generalist species has many adaptations to help it survive in changing conditions. It can eat a lot of different foods. It can survive in a lot of different areas. It is not specialized to one food or one environment. It can do many different things. Areas tend to have a low amount of biodiversity, have a high, what I'm trying to say here is that species that have a broad niche, that are generalists, tend to live in areas that have low biodiversity. And as a result, there's actually high populations of these generalist species. So for example, if we take a look at the snowshoe hare, okay, that would be a generalist species. It can eat a lot of different kinds of food, okay, and there would be a lot of snowshoe hares within an area. It would have a high population. So typical of harsh climates, northern Canada, great example of where we find a lot of generalist species. So these are animals that can live under varying conditions. And as we go towards the poles, we find more and more generalist species that have a broad niche. and less specialists that have a very narrow niche, which means they have very few food sources that they rely on, and they have a very, very specific role that they play. Another kind of term we can say is that things that are generalists, that have broad niches, are very adaptable. Okay, they can kind of pivot. When one food source goes away, then they have another food source that they'll end up eating. So organisms need to be good at a lot of things and eat many different things due to the drastic changes in climate they face, which is why they're generalist species. Wolves, mice, rats, these are all generalist species. Raccoons, for example, deer, these are generalists. Now, if we look at a narrow niche, which are narrow niche species, which are called specialists, they have adaptations to help them survive in one environment only. They are unable to live elsewhere, and this is known as the trap of specialization. Okay, so what that means is if their food source or their normal habitat ends up being destroyed, they're stuck. They can't survive because they are specially adapted to that one food source, okay, or very few food sources, or that one area. So that is the trap of specialization. We find specialists in areas that have very high biodiversity, and normally they have very small populations. So we kind of actually have this interesting kind of connection that if we have a large amount of biodiversity, then we have tons of species, but we have very few populations of those species. Where we have low amounts of biodiversity, okay, we have very few species, but we have high numbers of those species. Okay, so large populations of those species. All right, so that's a specialist. It has a very narrow niche, which means it relies on very few food sources. Okay, it can only, it's adapted to survive in kind of like only one area. It plays a very specific role. So if I take a look at where I'm going to find a lot of specialists, a lot of high biodiversity, you can see these green areas here, what's painted green. These are the humid tropical regions of the world. That's where we're going to find a ton of specialists that have very narrow niches, okay, in the tropical rainforest environments. So let's talk about competition. Competition occurs in environments where resources must be shared by a number of different individuals. So there's limited resources. So there's competition for the limited resources, and it occurs when two organisms share the same niche. So in other words, they are competing for the same food source, the same habitat, whatever. This can happen between organisms of the same species or organisms of different species. That's still competition, even if it's within the same species. Now, organisms in competition may have to adapt to survive by changing their niche. So for example, if you're both competing for the same food source, well, then you could actually switch to a different food source instead, right? And that way you eliminate the competition. This may happen immediately, right? So like changing feeding grounds, for example, so you don't have to share feeding grounds with another animal or another species, or it can happen over generations. So for example, like for owls becoming nocturnal. So now they no longer have to have that same niche as, let's say, hawks, right? But instead they're hunting at a different time, and they're hunting different animals that are also nocturnal and out at night. So by changing the niche, as a result, they actually no longer have the same amount of competition. So let's look at competition within a species. And this is piranhas basically competing each other for food when they're hungry and they smell some blood. So we'll watch that video. Here's another video. This is competition across different species. So here we have a hyena and a cheetah, and they are competing for an impala. So we'll check out that video as well. Okay, some species develop very specific niches to minimize competition. So they actually find a very specific niche that makes it so that they are no longer competing with something else. This is a video about resource partitioning of the warblers that we'll take a look at that kind of talks about what we were looking at before. Now, there are organisms that have decided to actually, I shouldn't say decided, that have ended up or adapted to living in extreme environments in order to not have to compete. So they found a niche that works for them, but it's still an incredibly harsh and severe and extreme environment. So, for example, the woodland tree frog lives in areas that get incredibly cold, and it actually freezes for weeks at a time to deal with cold temperatures. And then as it thaws, it reanimates and basically like almost comes back to life after being frozen. So it can actually survive freezing conditions as a tree frog. The Japanese snow monkeys are the only primates other than humans that can stand incredibly cold, freezing temperatures because they've adapted by having this amazing fur coat. And as a result, they have a niche where they can survive in an area that's very extreme to lower competition. We even have things like bacteria living at very high temperatures in Yellowstone, where it's like boiling water, and bacteria can actually survive there because it's adapted to these extreme conditions. Or watermelon snow in glaciers, where we actually have this, I think it's an algae, an algae that actually like survives in ice. Okay, on glaciers, where it actually can, even when it's frozen, survive and thrive basically in something that's really extreme. So by dealing with these extreme conditions, it gets away from competing for resources. All right, well, that's it for niches. So really important thing is understanding that a niche is basically where an organism lives and what it does, okay, and that things have different niches in order to get away from competition. And when two organisms or two species have the same niche, well, then they're competing. So how do we get around this? Well, things like resource partitioning or adapting so that they have a unique niche. Organisms that have a broad niche are called generalists, and they can eat lots of different foods, survive in lots of different environments, and they're found as we go more towards the poles, and they have high population numbers. And then organisms that have a narrow niche, which are called specialists, are often closer to the equator. They only eat a small amount of food, right? Like very specific things, and they can only really live in one specific environment. We call that the trap of specialization. So areas that are closer to the equator have very high biodiversity, but the species that are there have very low, typically, populations. All right, that's it. Have a good day.